It was a hot summer afternoon in a quiet town, nestled on the outskirts of a bustling city. The kind of place where everyone knows each other's name, and news travels fast, whether it's good or bad. But this wasn't going to be the typical neighborhood gossip. This story was about a dog who had been chained for 7 long years, and a man who would change everything. The dog was once a puppy, full of energy and curiosity, much like any other young dog. But as the years passed, its life became a monotonous cycle of chains, confinement, and isolation. The world outside the small yard was nothing but a blur of passing vehicles, distant sounds, and the occasional bird flying overhead. But for this dog, the world was limited to its small cage, a life without freedom, without love, and without hope. Every day, as the sun rose, the dog would wake up in the same spot, tied to the same rusty chain that had become its prison. The owner, a man named Greg, had long since stopped caring for the dog. Greg was a man of routine, and the dog was nothing more than an object in his daily life, a reminder of a past mistake, a reminder of something he had once promised to care for but now ignored. Greg's home was nothing more than a place to sleep, eat, and leave in the morning. His life had become a blur of indifference, just like the world around the dog. For 7 years, the dog had no companionship, no human touch, no affection. It was a shadow of its former self. But what remained was an overwhelming sense of anger. The dog had learned to mistrust people, to view them as a threat rather than a source of comfort. When humans came near, it would growl, bark, and snap, desperate to protect itself from the pain it had experienced in the past. The world had been cruel to it, and it had learned to be cruel right back. But everything changed the day Jason came to town. Jason was a man with a heart full of compassion and a deep love for animals. He had always been the type of person who couldn't walk past a stray dog without stopping to give it a pat or a kind word. His friends often joked that he had an invisible leash that led him to the most heartbroken animals, the ones that were in need of help the most. So when Jason heard about the dog that had been chained for 7 years, he knew he couldn't just turn a blind eye. He had to do something. The town had heard rumors of the dog, the one that attacked anyone who came near, the one who was so full of rage that no one dared to approach it. But Jason wasn't like the others. He didn't believe in giving up on animals. He believed in redemption, in second chances. And as soon as he saw the dog, something clicked inside him. He knew that this animal was not beyond saving. It just needed someone to show it love, someone to prove that not all humans were out to hurt it. But what Jason didn't realize was that this was going to be a much harder challenge than he had imagined. The dog, for all its fury, wasn't just angry, it was terrified. Terrified of the world outside its cage, terrified of being hurt again. It had learned that trust was something to be avoided, not embraced. So when Jason made his first move to get closer to the dog, the animal reacted in a way that Jason hadn't expected. With an attack. The dog lunged at him, teeth bared, eyes wild with fear and anger. Jason had no choice but to step back, shocked by the sheer force of the animal's response. It was clear that this wasn't just a simple case of aggression, it was a survival instinct. The dog was defending itself from the pain it had endured for so long. Jason stood there, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, he wondered if he had made a mistake. But then he remembered why he was here, why he couldn't walk away. He wasn't going to give up. This dog needed him, and he wasn't about to let it down. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and made a decision that would change everything. He would not leave until this dog knew that not all humans were enemies. The first thing Jason did was simply wait. He didn't approach the dog. Instead, he sat a safe distance away, watching it closely, reading its every move. He didn't want to make the same mistake Greg had made, forcing the dog into a corner and expecting it to trust him. He wanted the dog to choose to trust him, and that meant giving it space, giving it time. Days passed, and Jason remained a fixture in the dog's life. He would come every day, sitting quietly in the yard, reading a book, or simply talking to the dog in a calm, soothing voice. At first, the dog would bark and growl, its eyes wide with suspicion. But slowly, as the days turned into weeks, something started to change. The dog stopped growling as much. It still watched Jason with caution, but the hatred in its eyes began to soften. Jason knew that he couldn't force the dog to trust him. He had to earn it. And earning trust was a slow process, one that required patience, understanding, and a willingness to face fear head-on. Jason never gave up on the dog. He knew that it was worth fighting for. And then, one day, it happened. The dog, after 7 long years of being chained and mistreated, took a hesitant step toward Jason. It wasn't much, just a small step, but it was enough to give Jason hope. He held his breath, waiting for the dog to retreat, to go back to the safety of its familiar chains. But it didn't. Instead, the dog took another step, and then another, until it was standing just a few feet away from Jason. Jason didn't move. He simply sat there, his heart racing with excitement and fear. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment that could either be the beginning of something beautiful or the end of everything. And then, in a gesture that took Jason's breath away, the dog sat down beside him. It was as if it had finally realized that Jason wasn't a threat, that he wasn't there to hurt it. For the first time in years, the dog was able to relax, to trust. Jason reached out slowly, cautiously, and gently placed his hand on the dog's head. The dog didn't flinch. It didn't growl. Instead, it closed its eyes and leaned into the touch, letting out a soft sigh of relief. Jason smiled, tears welling up in his eyes. This was it. This was what he had been waiting for. But this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but Jason was ready. He knew that the dog wasn't the only one who needed healing. He, too, had his own demons to face, demons that this dog, this beautiful animal, would help him confront. And so, the journey of healing began. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be setbacks. There would be moments of doubt. But together, they would face the challenges ahead. Jason knew that, just like the dog, he had his own scars to overcome. But as long as they faced them together, there was hope. Jason stood at the edge of the yard, looking down at the dog he had been working with for the past few weeks. Its eyes were still filled with weariness. But now, there was something else, a flicker of curiosity. It wasn't the same animal that had snarled and lunged at him in terror just a few days ago. The dog had softened, but not completely. There was still work to be done, still fear to overcome. But for Jason, this small victory was a sign that they were on the right path. Jason was no stranger to hardship. He had grown up in a tough neighborhood, where survival was often a matter of outlasting the next wave of challenges life threw at you. His own childhood had been marked by loneliness and an unspoken sense of abandonment. His parents were rarely home, lost in their own battles, and he had learned to fend for himself at a young age. But there was one constant in his life, his love for animals. From a young age, Jason had felt a connection to creatures who, like him, had been misunderstood or left behind. Animals never judged him for his past, never made him feel like he didn't belong. They simply accepted him for who he was. That connection had only deepened as Jason grew older, and eventually, he had dedicated his life to working with animals, especially those that had been abused or neglected. He had been working at a local animal shelter for years, where he helped rehabilitate pets who had been through the worst. But there was something different about this dog, something that tugged at his heart in a way that no other animal had. Maybe it was the sheer brutality of the dog's past, or maybe it was a challenge that the dog represented. Whatever the reason, Jason knew that this dog was special, and he wasn't going to give up on it. But even as Jason's connection to the dog deepened, the dog's past was still very much alive in its behavior. It was clear that the dog had been through trauma, the kind that couldn't simply be erased with a few kind words or gentle touches. Every time Jason tried to get closer, the dog would flinch, retreating back into the corner of the yard, its body language screaming for space. And yet, it would also look at him from time to time, its eyes filled with an almost desperate longing for affection, a yearning that Jason could feel even when the dog was at its most guarded. Jason often found himself reflecting on his own struggles. He had his own scars, his own pain, but over the years, he had learned to mask it, to push it aside. But with the dog, Jason couldn't hide from the truth. The dog's pain mirrored his own in so many ways. It had been abandoned, just like him. It had been left to fend for itself, to survive in a world that had forgotten about it. And now, just like Jason, it was learning to trust again. The dog's name was Maximum. Jason hadn't learned that right away, but over time, he came to know it. Max had been a gift to Greg years ago, a puppy full of promise. But as Greg's life spiraled downward, so did Max's. The bond that should have formed between owner and pet had turned into something much darker, a relationship defined by neglect and fear. Max had been chained to a post in the yard, where he spent the majority of his days alone. Over the years, Greg's neglect had turned into outright hostility, and Max's aggression grew with it. The dog's mistrust of humans wasn't just a result of fear, it was a result of deep betrayal. Max had once known kindness, but over time, that had been replaced with indifference and cruelty. The scars left by years of isolation weren't just physical, they were psychological, and they ran deep. Max wasn't just fighting to survive in a harsh world, he was fighting against the betrayal he had endured. As Jason sat by the fence, watching Max from a distance, he began to understand the depth of the dog's struggle. It wasn't just about feeding and grooming. It was about breaking through years of pain and mistrust. Jason wasn't just healing a dog. He was healing himself. In many ways, this journey was as much about his own redemption as it was about Max's. Jason saw in Max the same feelings of abandonment, the same fear of being hurt again, that he had struggled with for years. And like Max, Jason had to face his demons if he wanted to move forward. Jason's relationship with Max grew slowly, but steadily. Every day, he made a point of showing Max that he was safe, that he could be trusted. He never forced the dog into uncomfortable situations, but instead, he waited patiently for Max to come to him. He learned to read Max's body language, when the dog was ready to approach, when it needed space, and when it just needed reassurance. Slowly but surely, Max started to trust again. The first time Max nuzzled Jason's hand, the gesture was hesitant, but it was enough to send a rush of warmth through Jason's chest. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. But even as the connection between Jason and Max deepened, Greg's presence loomed large in the background. Greg was still in the picture, still coming around to the house to check on the dog, still carrying with him the bitterness that had once defined his relationship with Maximum. Jason knew that he couldn't completely remove the pain Max had suffered under Greg's care, but he could offer something different, something that Max had never known: real love, real companionship, and the possibility of a future without fear. But it wasn't just Greg who presented a challenge. Jason had his own fears to confront, fears that he wasn't enough to save Max, fears that the dog's past might be too much for them to overcome. Jason often found himself doubting whether he could really change the dog's life. But each time Max showed even the smallest sign of trust, Jason's determination grew stronger. The journey was far from over, but Jason knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to quit. Max had been through too much, and Jason wasn't about to let him face the world alone. He would stand by Max, just as he had stood by so many other animals in need. Together, they would face the challenges ahead, whatever they may be. As Jason looked at Max, he smiled, knowing that this was just the beginning of their journey together. They were both healing, one step at a time, and for the first time in years, both of them had hope. Days passed, and the bond between Jason and Max grew stronger, but so did the tension that surrounded their situation. The dog's transformation wasn't a smooth, linear process. Every step forward seemed to be followed by 2 steps back. Just as Max would show signs of trust, something would trigger his past fears, causing him to retreat into the darkness once again. Jason knew that the hardest part wasn't going to be the physical care of the dog. It was going to be the emotional healing. Max's scars ran deeper than just the physical ones, and while Jason had come to care for the dog as one of his own, he was beginning to realize just how complicated the journey would be. There were moments when Max would look at him, those deep brown eyes filled with raw emotion, longing, fear, and pain all swimming together in an unspoken plea for help. But as the days went on, there were also signs of progress. Max no longer retreated when Jason approached. He allowed Jason to feed him, to touch him. But at times, when Jason would extend his hand too quickly, Max would flinch, growl low in his throat, and pull away, making it clear that trust was something that couldn't be rushed. This back-and-forth between closeness and distance left Jason emotionally drained. He could see the dog's potential, the spark of the animal he had once been, but every time it seemed within reach, it slipped away again. It was as if the dog was caught in a loop of fear and uncertainty, unable to fully escape its past. The people in the neighborhood had been watching the gradual changes, too. At first, they had whispered behind Jason's back, unsure of his efforts and doubtful of Max's ability to change. They didn't understand what Jason saw in the dog, nor did they believe it could ever become the loving companion he hoped for. To them, Max was nothing more than a dangerous animal, a threat that had to be contained. And that belief lingered, creating an invisible barrier between Jason and the rest of the town. It wasn't long before rumors started to spread. Some people had seen Max growl at children, while others had heard the dog bark furiously at passers-by. Jason had done his best to ensure Max didn't interact with anyone other than himself, but there was no stopping the gossip. The whispers turned into warnings, and soon, more and more people were urging Jason to give up on the dog before something bad happened. Then, one fateful afternoon, the situation escalated. Jason was sitting in the yard, reading a book, when he heard the unmistakable sound of car tires screeching to a halt in front of the house. He looked up to see Greg standing there, his expression dark and filled with anger. It had been weeks since Jason had seen Greg, and for good reason. Greg had never been one to offer support for the rehabilitation of his own dog. He had only shown up occasionally to check on the dog, never once showing any real concern for Max's well-being. But today was different. Greg had come to take Max back. "You're wasting your time," Greg snapped, his voice sharp and bitter as he stepped out of his car. "That dog isn't going to change. He's wild, he's broken. You don't know what you're doing." Jason stood up, ready to defend his decision to help Max, but he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had always known that Greg would show up eventually, but he hadn't expected it to be like this. He had hoped that Greg would see the changes in Max and recognize the effort Jason had put into the dog's healing. But Greg's heart was hardened by years of neglect, and he wasn't about to see things any differently. "He's not your dog anymore," Jason replied firmly, standing his ground. "He deserves a chance, a real chance, to heal. And I'm not giving up on him." Greg sneered, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can just waltz in and fix everything? This is my dog, and I don't want him here anymore. He's not some project for you to feel good about. He's a liability." Jason's heart sank. He could feel the tension in the air, heavy and thick, and he knew this wasn't just about the dog anymore. It was about pride, control, and fear. Greg couldn't see the dog's potential because he couldn't see past his own bitterness. He saw Max as an extension of his failure, and letting go of that would mean confronting everything he had ignored for years. "I won't let you take him," Jason said, his voice steady but firm. "Max has been through enough. He deserves a chance at a better life, one where he's not chained up and forgotten. He's been abandoned for too long." Greg took a step closer, his fists clenched. "You're making a mistake, Jason. That dog will never change, and neither will you. You're just as messed up as he is." Jason's chest tightened, and for a moment, he felt the sting of Greg's words. But he knew he couldn't back down now. Not when they were so close. Not when Max had already shown signs of hope. The anger in Greg's eyes only fueled Jason's determination. He wasn't going to let this man define Max's future. With a deep breath, Jason stood tall. "I'm not giving up on him." If you want to take him, you'll have to go through me." For a moment, the two men stood in a tense silence, the air thick with animosity. But just as Greg took a step forward, Max emerged from the shadows, standing beside Jason. The dog's posture was calm but firm, as if he sensed the conflict and was choosing his side. He had been watching the exchange from the corner of the yard, unsure of what to make of it. But now, in the presence of the man who had shown him kindness and patience, Max made his choice. He wasn't going back to a life of fear and neglect. He had found something worth fighting for. Greg hesitated, his eyes flicking between Jason and the dog. For a moment, it seemed like he might give in, but then the anger in his face faded into something else, something that resembled resignation. "I'll be back for him," Greg muttered, turning away and climbing back into his car. "Don't think this is over." As the sound of Greg's car faded into the distance, Jason's heart was still pounding in his chest. But this was a battle, not a war. Greg had retreated, but he would come back, and when he did, Jason would be ready. Max had made his choice, and Jason would honor it. But the real fight was only just beginning. Jason had known that Greg wouldn't give up easily. The man's sense of entitlement over Max, his unwillingness to acknowledge the dog's need for care and compassion, had been glaringly obvious from the start. Jason had faced difficult challenges before. He'd worked with animals who had suffered under neglect, abuse, and abandonment. But this was different. This was a fight that wasn't just about helping an animal. It was about taking a stand against the cruelty that had defined Max's life for far too long. The days that followed Greg's departure were tense. Jason could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. Max was no longer just a dog in need of rehabilitation. He had become a symbol of the battle between compassion and neglect, between love and indifference. But Jason couldn't afford to focus on the weight of the battle alone. He had to keep moving forward, for Max and for himself. There was still so much work to be done, so much healing left to achieve. Jason continued his routine with Maximum. Every day, he would spend hours with him, working on trust, on socialization, on simple affection. There were moments of progress, and then there were setbacks. Some days, Max would come to him for pets, nuzzle his hand, or even lie down beside him on the porch. Other days, the dog would retreat, growling softly if Jason got too close. Jason didn't take it personally. He knew that healing was a process, one that took time and patience. But the bond between them was undeniable. Every step Max took toward trusting Jason was a victory, and with each small victory, their bond deepened. Jason started to see Max as more than just a dog in need of rehabilitation. Max had become his partner, his friend. Their journeys were intertwined, both struggling to overcome their own traumas, both searching for healing. Then, a week after Greg's visit, something unexpected happened. It was a quiet evening, and Jason was sitting in the yard, watching the sunset. Max was lying next to him, his head resting on Jason's foot. For the first time in weeks, Jason felt at peace. But that peace was shattered when the sound of tires screeching to a halt echoed through the air. Jason's heart raced as he looked up and saw Greg's car pull up once again. This time, Jason wasn't caught off guard. He had expected Greg to return, but the sight of the man, standing there with a cold, determined look in his eyes, made Jason's stomach churn. "You can't just keep him, Jason," Greg shouted, stepping out of his car and walking toward the yard. "He's mine. I'm not letting you turn him into some charity case. He belongs with me." Jason stood up, his fists clenched, but he took a deep breath to steady himself. "Greg, this isn't about ownership. It's about what's best for Maximum, and you've never given him that. He deserves better than to be chained up and neglected." Greg's eyes flicked to Max, who was now standing beside Jason, his posture rigid, watching Greg with a mix of suspicion and defiance. Jason could see the moment when Greg realized that Max wasn't the same dog he had abandoned all those years ago. Max wasn't cowering in fear anymore. He was standing tall, standing with Jason, and it was clear that the dog wasn't interested in going back to the life he had known. Greg stepped forward, his voice rising with frustration. "You think you can just take my dog away from me? You think you can change him? He's dangerous, Jason. He'll never be the same. He's better off with me." Jason's heart pounded in his chest, but he held his ground. He wasn't backing down. "Max isn't yours anymore, Greg. He's his own, and he has the right to live without fear. You're not going to drag him back into the hell you kept him in." For a moment, Greg just stared at him, disbelief written on his face. He couldn't comprehend that the dog he had mistreated, the animal he had cast aside, was now standing at the side of a man who had shown him love and care. Max's transformation wasn't just physical. It was emotional, psychological. It was clear that the bond between Jason and Max had become something powerful, something that no one, not even Greg, could break. But Greg wasn't ready to accept that. With one last glare, he turned and stormed back to his car. "This isn't over, Jason. I'll take you to court if I have to. That dog is mine." Jason didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew that Greg's words were born out of fear and desperation, not logic. Deep down, Jason could see that Greg was afraid of losing control, afraid of facing the consequences of his past mistakes. And that fear would drive him, make threats, to make promises he couldn't keep. But Jason wasn't worried. He had something far stronger than any threat. He had Max's trust. As Greg's car disappeared into the distance, Jason turned to Max, who was standing silently beside him. The dog's eyes met his, filled with a quiet understanding. Jason smiled, crouching down to the dog's level. "It's okay, Max," he whispered softly, rubbing the dog's ears. "You're safe now." For the first time, Max didn't flinch at the touch. He leaned into Jason, his body relaxed, his tail wagging ever so slightly. Jason's heart swelled with pride. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. Max was home, not just physically, but emotionally. He had found a place where he was loved, where he was cared for, where he was finally free to be himself. The conflict was over, but the journey wasn't. Jason knew that there would still be obstacles ahead. There would still be moments of doubt, moments of struggle. But with Max by his side, Jason felt ready to face whatever came next. Together, they had overcome the past, and together, they would build a future where trust and love were the foundations, not fear and pain. The weeks that followed Greg's final attempt to reclaim Max were filled with quiet victories. Every day, Jason would spend time with Max, continuing the slow, patient work of building trust, of solidifying the bond they had formed. Max was no longer the dog who lashed out in fear, the animal who had been chained to a post for years. He had become a dog who sought affection, who enjoyed the simple pleasures of a peaceful life. A walk through the neighborhood, a soft pat on the head, the joy of running free in the yard. But it wasn't just Max who had changed. Jason had changed, too. In the early days, he had approached his mission with a sense of duty, a desire to save Max, to give him the life he deserved. But over time, Jason realized that the act of saving Max had also saved him. The years of emotional distance, the walls he had built around himself, began to crumble, brick by brick. Max had taught Jason the value of patience, the importance of confronting the past, and the power of second chances. As much as Jason had given to Max, Max had given just as much back, and in ways that Jason hadn't expected. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Jason found himself sitting on the porch with Max at his side. The air was warm, filled with the sounds of the neighborhood winding down for the day. Jason couldn't help but smile as Max rested his head on his lap, his eyes half closed in contentment. For the first time in a long time, Jason felt at peace. He realized that he hadn't just saved Max. Max had saved him, too. The struggles of the past still lingered in Jason's mind. The loneliness, the doubts, the scars that had shaped him into the person he had been. But now, sitting with Max, those feelings no longer defined him. He had a new sense of purpose, a new understanding of what it meant to truly heal. Max, too, had found peace. The dog who had once been a symbol of fear and pain was now a symbol of resilience and hope. No longer was he the dog chained to a post, forgotten and ignored. He was a dog who had been given a second chance, who had learned that trust could be rebuilt, that love could be given without conditions. Jason had shown him that the world could be a place of safety, a place where he no longer had to fight to survive. As Jason gently ran his fingers through Max's fur, he thought about how far they had both come. There had been so many moments when it had seemed impossible, so many times when it felt like the dog's trauma was too much to overcome. But here they were, together, stronger than before, having fought their demons side by side. Jason's thoughts drifted to the future. There was still so much to look forward to. Max had a long road ahead of him, but Jason was ready. He knew that there would still be challenges, maybe even more, as the world outside could be unpredictable and sometimes unforgiving. But together, they could face anything. They had already overcome the most difficult part, the decision to trust again. It was then that Jason realized something else, that he wasn't alone anymore. In the quiet moments, when he had been lost in his own mind, he had found comfort in knowing that Max was there. But it wasn't just the physical presence of the dog that mattered. It was the connection they shared, the bond that went beyond words, beyond action. It was a bond built on understanding, on the shared experience of overcoming pain and finding healing. Max's journey, like Jason's, was far from over. But in that moment, as the world settled into its rhythm, Jason understood that the greatest gift wasn't the healing he had given to Max. It was the healing Max had given to him. Tears welled up in Jason's eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude, of relief, of love. Jason didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. With Max by his side, he could face anything. Max lifted his head and looked up at Jason, as if sensing the shift in his emotions. The dog's eyes were soft, filled with understanding. Without a word, Max nudged Jason's hand, asking for a pet, a small gesture that meant so much. Jason smiled through his tears, running his hand through Max's fur. "Thank you, buddy," he whispered. "You've changed my life." In that moment, Jason realized that this was a true meaning of healing. It wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about embracing the imperfections, the scars, and the struggles that made them who they were. And in that embrace, they had both found peace.